Hey, welcome back to From His Thought. I'm your host, Michael Lewis. In this episode, I'm going to introduce a new format to the podcast, that of a conversation. These conversations will cover complex issues that help us better understand social policy and discourse. In this episode, I'm going to introduce you to Leondra Gonzalez, who will talk to us about data science, what it is, her experience in it, and how to break into the field. From algorithms to AI to the networks powering our world, this field plays a critical role in how we reason and make decisions collectively. From here, we move on to hot topics and controversies that are informed by the practice of data science. We cover how companies are being forced to rethink their infrastructures, how researchers are grappling with the immense power of machine learning, and how data science is causing us to rethink what we once thought we understood. I suspect after listening that you, like both Leondra and I, will be left wanting further discussion on some of the more controversial issues. I look forward to digging deeper into these issues with Leondra in the future as we continue our conversation. Indeed, we share common ground and technical backgrounds, but our worldviews are uniquely formed and shaped. These conversations might get challenging at times, but we believe they're necessary. For without dialogue, aimed at humble yet constructive ends, we're left facing a world of increasing nihilism and cynicism. I reject this outcome, and am grateful for the good faith Leondra extended to me. I hope you get as much out of our conversation as we did. Now, without further ado, and on behalf of Freedom Cast Incorporated, I present our conversation with Leondra Gonzalez. Hey there, and welcome to From His Thought. This is our first interview with Leondra Gonzalez, a data analytics professional at Microsoft. Hey, Leondra.
Hey, nice to see you, Mike.
Likewise. So Leondra and I first got to know each other, and I think this is correct, during the Harvard Data Science program a few years ago.
Yes, that is. Yeah, that is when we met.
Yeah, Leondra was kind enough to start organizing, herding sheep, as we like to say. Got a Discord server or something, or maybe a WhatsApp group arranged for us, and
something like that. Yeah, like a group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that was quite helpful. So we're going to cover a few things. Leondra's been very gracious with her time. We're going to cover her background, her story in data science, maybe some tips and tricks for people looking to break into it, people who are already in it, some of the kind of hot topics and controversies around data science, and then I promised a fun rapid fire round of questions towards the end. So I hope that this is illuminating for those of you listening. So Leondra, before we get into your background, can you tell me what data science means to you?
Ooh, that's a loaded question.
Yeah, no pressure.
Everyone's going to come with the pitchforks. To me, data science is the marriage of a number of disciplines to drive data-driven decisions. So I would say the core fundamentals are obviously statistics or mathematics, a little bit of computer science, and then, excuse the siren, I would say, obviously there's the domain expertise, but that's the area where I would say, that could be vast depending on the industry that you're in.
Sure. But
there's a little bit of engineering, a little bit of math and statistics, and then a little bit of computer science, and all with the overall goal of solving a business problem.
Awesome. I think that is a agreeable and comprehensive definition. The purists will not come out with their pitchforks and torches. I think that's pretty uncontroversial, so fair enough. So in your experience, and you've had several data science roles, feel free to speak about any one or any selection of them. What would you say a data scientist does generally day to day?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, it's sort of a mixture of a lot of different things. So for instance, you've got your domain area, right? And so it's a lot of meetings, I would say, to understand the business problem, the business context, the strategy, a lot of times that you're not fully aware of. And then there's understanding the underlying data. So that's the other part, I would say part two, is, going through the data. If you're lucky enough to have access to data dictionaries or any sort of documentation there, that would be great. But
of course,
that's generally rare in my experience.
Yes.
So it's a lot of experimentation and understanding the data, understanding how it's structured as well. So you're not doing any like joins that don't make any sense, for instance. And then there's the modeling part, which I'm going to go ahead and include the like preliminary statistical analysis in there as well. So understanding the distribution of the data, or understanding if there's any missing information, any sort of correlations or relationships, understanding, the dimensionality of the data. So there's the exploratory part, both technical and non-technical, and then there's like the modeling.
I think that's, again, very fair and comprehensive. What do you have a particular aspect that you think was perhaps most challenging for you as you were getting into data science?
Yes. And oddly enough, I feel like it's changed over time. So as someone who did not originally go to school for something technical, definitely the computer science side was very challenging for me. I think it was definitely a hump that I had to get over. Luckily, there's a lot of free and affordable information out there to learn those things, but it wasn't like I was going into it already as a software engineer or something like that. I've always liked math, and I consider myself to be good with numbers, so that part wasn't as daunting. Although I think over time, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And so then that's when you realize, oh, wow, I need to learn some more. So it kind of goes back and forth between getting comfortable with programming and then getting comfortable with like stats or calculus, and then realizing what you don't know. And it goes back and forth.
Sure, that's fair. I've heard this, and I hope I don't butcher this analogy, but I've heard it before, that kind of the relationship between your knowledge and your ignorance is that if you think about a circle, your knowledge is the area inside the circle, your awareness of your ignorance is the perimeter of the circle. So as your knowledge grows, so does your awareness of your ignorance.
Exactly.
So I think it's good. It's humbling. It also, I hope, or at least I think this theme will emerge in our conversation. Working in data science is something where you have to be comfortable not knowing things and trusting that you will learn them as you need them.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
Cool. So you did mention that you came from a kind of a non-traditional background, and I have a story about someone else who I think I'll probably be interviewing in the future, who came from a somewhat similar background, and maybe you could speak to that a bit. What's your background like? Where'd you grow up? What was your training in? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I always like telling the story because people are like, what? That doesn't make any sense. What was your plan? And it's like, I didn't really have one at the beginning. So my undergrad was actually in music and business. So essentially I did like a dual program where I went to school for violin, but my parents were like, you're not just going to go to school for violin, you need a backup plan. So I tacked on business as well. And a lot of the courses that I took in my business class, I would say exposed me to like statistics and marketing and operations, all those lovely business courses. And so when I was looking for internships, this is definitely where my interest in, I would say, analytics sparked. It was actually really hard to find internships that I was looking for at the time. At the time, I wanted to be like in music business. I wanted to be like a music supervisor or work in music publishing or something like that. But I'm from Columbus, Ohio, so there's not a ton of like music business in Ohio. And so I ended up getting this internship. My first internship was at the Ohio Department of Insurance. And I was basically an actuarial science internship there and working with a lot of spreadsheets. And that was actually my first exposure to SQL as well, working in databases. And I thought it was interesting. I didn't think much of it though. I didn't go, oh, this could be a career. It was just sort of like me satisfying a internship requirement at the time. And then from there, I moved on and did another internship for a music promoter, a small independent music promoter in Columbus, Ohio, in their marketing department. And they really seemed to value my ability to use numbers and Excel and all that more so than all the creative cool stuff that I wanted to get involved with. So from there, I graduated and I said, okay, I want to do grad school. And I found this really cool program at Carnegie Mellon that is an entertainment industry management program, but it is based in their information systems school. I still to this day don't really understand why it's based in that school, but because of that, I was exposed to a whole new world that I was never exposed to up until then. I was in some of these these classes you have to take as part of the program, where it's like you got to take stats, probability, you have to take like these database courses and stuff, because the idea is for you to be still quantitatively gifted, I guess, because it's
Sure.
CMU. So they want everyone coming out of there to be pretty good with computers. And so I was going to these classes with like software engineers and like data engineers, and these people have years of experience in this. And I was getting great grades. I was getting A's in like my stats classes and everything. And I was like, I can do this actually. Like, I can actually do this. And I never thought of it as a career until then. And in fact, I remember, I will always talk about this conversation because I think this was like the moment where I changed my mind, was when I had a conversation with someone who was getting internships. Everyone was talking about their internships, right? And I'm one of the entertainment kids, so I'm like just trying to get an internship at like NBC or Sony or something, just to like make minimum wage this summer.
Right.
And I was talking to this other person, and they're like, oh yeah, I got an internship at IBM. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Can I ask you like how much that pays? And they're like, oh, $60 an hour. And I was like, that's an internship? You know, like for me, you know, I don't come from like a wealthy family or anything. So like $60 an hour is like a good paying job from my perspective. Yeah. So that really opened my eyes. Like I am in the wrong major or something. So from there, it kind of took off. I kept getting these jobs that were like, hey, you need to know how to use Excel or Access or work your way around a database. And it wasn't until my graduate school where I got experience in R. So from one of the stats classes I took, we had to use R. And I started using that on the job one time because Excel just wasn't cutting it anymore. It kept crashing and all that. And then from there, I just ended up learning Python. And it's just kind of like an iterative process of like, oh, what's this? And you learn more, and then you get a job and you learn more on the job. And that's pretty much my origin story, I guess.
Would you say that it's fair to summarize part of that is it's not that everything has to be planned out in some sort of perfect linear fashion before you begin?
Yes, exactly. I don't think I'd be surprised if that actually still happens. Even people who've gone through school of computer science or math or whatever, I don't feel like what they had planned is where they ended up in most cases.
Yes, as a marine biology major, I can tell you that is at least the case for me as well. So let's back up just a bit. I want to touch on a couple of things you mentioned. One, that you played violin. So you played violin. I played violin quite poorly, but for a while. And then a gentleman who is also a data scientist in the tech space that I'm familiar with, he plays violin quite well. And so it's interesting that there's this overlap coming from a music background, a life sciences background in my case, or he has an accounting background.
Oh.
So do you think that there's anything there about that in your experience? Obviously, we're not trying to generalize from a sample size of 3, but do you think that there's something there? Because I think people originally, when they were getting into data science, they were coming from computer science, physics, that kind of background. And certainly those technical skills are great. But is there something, you know, more creative about data science that draws in people from different backgrounds?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways you can think about it. For me personally, I know a lot of people who actually come from a music background and end up going to something more technical, whether it's data science or software engineering. I think it's because with music in particular, I feel like it probably uses the same side of the brain that you use for math, because it's basically audible math, if you think about it. So I think there might be a correlation between people who enjoy music and who are adept in math, but there might not necessarily be someone who is into music and wants to do something technical.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think there's probably like, do you have the capacity to do it, and do you want to do it? Right. And then I also think there's probably a third small group that I also feel like I overlap in, which is, were you exposed to this as a career option? which for me, I wasn't. So I think that is something to consider too.
Yes. I hope we can talk about this in terms of pipeline problem, as it's been dubbed, or representation, all sorts of issues around that here in a little bit. So one more thing on the violin, then I promise I'll let it go. So are you familiar with the duo? They're a musical duo called the Two Cellos.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Whenever someone asks me who's not from the data science space, and this is, you can give me your, unvarnished critical feedback if you want to hear. When they ask me what data science is, I send them a video of the two cellos playing music, right? Because it's always some sort of classical music with a twist. They're quite gifted with the stringed instruments they have to be playing, usually cellos. But they play, the way they use the instrument is different than I think most people are traditionally, certainly they're traditionally taught, but when you traditionally hear a cello as well. And I think about that as a reasonably good analogy for data science, that you need to have certain mastery of fundamental skills before you can start to be creative and apply them in new ways. But once you have that, you don't have to be, you don't have to be at their level to be able to break into data science, but you do need some level of strict training. And then that process of disciplining yourself then opens up the landscape again for you to kind of do something new.
Yes, I totally agree. In fact, it's so funny you say that, because I'm like a huge fan of like prog rock, and there's this band I follow called Polyphia. They're actually, I think they're from Texas. They're amazing. I highly recommend looking them up. They're like my favorite band, but
Awesome.
It's basically instrumental guitar music for the most part. And I was watching this video the other day of a guitar teacher reviewing one of their newest songs that came out. And he was obviously blown away, because these guys are like prodigies, all four of them. I think there's four. They're prodigies at what they do. And the one thing that the music teacher pointed out is that even though they're able to do these like crazy fast notes and crazy tricky rhythms and all that, what he's actually really impressed with is their fundamentals and how well they're able to apply it in a way where they can do all this crazy stuff, but the reason why they're so palatable for non-music nerds is because they're able to use a fundamental music writing theory to attract people who maybe are just into like radio music or pop music. So I think there is something to be said about learning the fundamentals and then using it to your advantage. And then even when you do go on to like one of these super crazy things, like you get into deep learning or something, you're still going to need to know the fundamentals regardless.
Yeah. I think that's a good piece of advice. I taught first, so we're both, Leondra and I are both PhD students at different universities, but I taught my first class this past semester. It was one of the fundamental classes that undergraduate IS students, usually juniors, have to take. And it was programming in Java, which I'm not the world's best programmer, and certainly not the world's best programmer in Java. But I always tell them, you can never be too good at the fundamentals. And so, if you're trying to kind of sharpen whatever tools you're trying to bring to industry in an internship and a job, you can always go back and improve there. And it will pay dividends later on. It's one of the things that kind of keeps on giving. And then, as you mentioned, you can then become more creative. And I think your story kind of highlights the fact that you can take skills that you didn't know were valuable and use them in a valuable way. And I think that's how a lot of us get into this field.
Absolutely. And I'm actually learning Java now. So
nice.
I might message you with a question later.
Well, if I have the answer, I'd be happy to provide it. And if not, I have the guy was my supervisor, worked in industry for like 40 years doing this stuff. So I can be happy to ask him.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. He's a godsend for the university. He effectively works for less than minimum wage. Now that he's retired, he views it as giving back to the Houston community.
That's nice.
Yeah, he's great. He's fantastic. And of course, an adjunct professor, a lecturer, not a traditional academic, which is, I think, good for students who want to know what people in industry are looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about kind of your experience in data science, generally speaking. People will forgive me for continuing to use the buzzword, but we're talking loosely in this area. What's been the most rewarding part of your experience career-wise, something you've learned, an interaction you've had, whatever, however you want to answer that is fine.
Yeah, I would say the most rewarding thing, as well as the most frustrating thing is two things. Figuring out a problem that took forever to figure out, that's rewarding, but obviously it was very annoying before you figured it out.
Sure.
And then likewise, learning something new. I consider myself to be someone who likes to learn new things, but sometimes you do feel like, I wish that I didn't feel the pressure to learn new things all the time. But when you do learn that thing, it feels really, really good. So
that's awesome. So that actually is nice, because I think you at least touched on, if not answered, my next question, but I'll put it to you in case you want to add something more to it. Is there a particular challenge that comes to mind that you've overcome that you really felt like was a kind of like a watershed moment for you in your career?
Yeah, I would definitely add imposter syndrome. That is something that never goes away for me. And apparently, you know, based on conversations I've had with very senior professionals in the field, it doesn't go away. You know, there's people who are, you know, they've been doing this for 40 years. You know, maybe your professor still has it. I don't know.
Sure.
But yeah, it's actually kind of humbling, and it's cool to see that you're not alone in that. And I think after having it for so long, and after working with so many different people from different backgrounds, you realize that it's actually just normal. You know, it's not like this bad thing to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think imposter syndrome that's relatively under control can be constructive for you. It can help propel you forward. But it, certainly there's a a downside to that too, where it can become overwhelming.
Yes, it's all about control, like you said. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Can you tell me about a time where a mentor or a teammate really came through for you that you thought that kind of interaction really enriched your experience in the field?
Yeah, man, there's a couple, but the one that comes to mind is actually when was this? A couple of years ago, before COVID days, and I was at a data science conference here in LA, and I remember feeling a bit out of place. I felt kind of like, you know, like I felt like no one was really talking to me or really engaging with me, and I didn't personally know anyone there. I kind of went by myself, so that was also something that I wasn't maybe prepared for. And, you know, there were like networking hours and everything, and I was networking, but I didn't feel like I was really connecting with anyone. And then I remember I asked this one woman, she was a data engineer at Netflix. I asked her like to tell me a little bit more about her background and how she got into her field. And she was so warm and opening, and like she just made my day. Prior to my interaction with her, I felt like I was going to call my mom crying and telling her that I didn't want to work in tech anymore, basically. But she literally like saved the day for me. And she even invited me, like, I didn't even ask for this, but she invited me to swing by the Netflix headquarters and have lunch with her, and just to talk about, you know, how her job is. And ever since, we've actually kept in touch every now and then. And she's just, I'm so grateful for her. I might not even be here if it weren't for her. So
it's pretty awesome when you come across someone like that, right?
Yeah, it's incredible.
I also think that there's another lesson there for people, and certainly, you know, you and I being relatively young in our careers, we can take this forward, but so can, you know, current leaders and movers and shakers in the industry. Something that might seem like a trivial interaction to you might not be so trivial to someone else.
Yes.
And so whether you're a leader who's like just kind of extending a hand to someone, or sitting down and having a chat that can help propel them to keep going forward, overcome that imposter syndrome for that day, or whether you're a student who is introverted by nature, let's say, and you don't want to go to a networking event. You don't have to be Mr. or Mrs. Magnanimous. You can be someone who goes and makes one or two quality connections, and you never know which one of those will lead to opportunities down the line. That could be obviously material in terms of a job, but it could also be unique collaborations, or just someone you go and have coffee with a couple times a year and talk shop.
Absolutely. And you're so right, Michael, because I just recently had an interaction where I was on the other end of the stick. I was keeping in touch with this young woman at Microsoft who is sort of, considering her options, looking around, trying to figure out what she wants to do next. She doesn't necessarily come from a technical background. I think her one of her undergraduate degrees was in economics, but she doesn't have like a computer science degree or anything like that. And I just connected with her for the second time this week, and she had told me about how like amazing our interaction was the first time, and how it like she literally chopped her hair off. Like this is going to be an interesting discussion, but like in the Black community, it's actually it can be a challenge for some Black women to wear their natural hair in the workplace, because they don't want to like experience stigma or whatever. And she said, you really inspired me to do that, because I made a post on LinkedIn a couple months back or something about it. And she literally chopped her hair off. And she showed up the next day with like her natural hair. And she was like, you inspired me so much. And I was like, whoa, I hope that you really like that decision. But she looked gorgeous.
Sure.
She looked gorgeous. And she also just felt really energized about her career after our conversation. So I didn't know it had that impact at all.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, the kind of ripple effect is real, and it's humbling and kind of scary, but ultimately I think very meaningful.
Yes.
That's great. Okay, so last part before we transition, are there any pieces of advice you'd offer to people, either in terms of skills they can pick up? You mentioned some courses. Obviously, we're both familiar with online programs, that kind of thing, that they can do along the way if they're looking to break in or kind of move up in this industry. And are there any, words to the wise about maybe this career field isn't for you if certain things don't appeal to you or something like that?
That's a good point. I don't think people talk about that a lot, actually. For the first question, I would say there is like no end to the resources that you can tap into to learn this stuff. Whether it's math or whether it's programming or whether it's like engineering or like databases or whatever it is that you want to learn, everything from like just YouTube to like full-blown certification courses. And there's even like online, like full-blown master's degrees you can take now. So there's plenty of information out there. I would say don't become overwhelmed with the magnitude of the information out there. I would say maybe try to find a template of like a program that someone might do if they want to become a data scientist, and like kind of pick from there, cherry pick, and kind of design your own path. That's effectively what I did. I was like, oh, it seems like I need to learn that. And another good way you can get that list is by just looking at job descriptions. Like, oh, apparently you have to know this, so I'm going to add that to my list. And so I would recommend that. In terms of any early signals that it's not for you, that is very interesting. I would say if you don't enjoy programming, it might not be for you, just because it's kind of a core component of the job. But I would definitely say don't automatically believe that you're not fit for it because, oh, I'm not a programmer or I'm not a software developer or something like that. Because it's actually pretty fun, actually, if I think taught right, and if you have the time to actually learn it, it can be very fun. It's almost like a video game in some ways. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Quite literally, actually, for some people, right?
Yeah, literally.
Yeah. I think I heard you say on another podcast that you viewed the programming, the discipline of programming, similar to how you view the discipline of learning a musical instrument. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I can't believe you found that. It's like deep cut. Yeah, it is. So one thing that I think something that really transitioned from my undergraduate degree to my current career is just the level of rigor required to learn something new or to master, quote unquote, master something. So, learning the violin, it takes a ton of practice, takes a ton of discipline. It takes you setting out the time to learn it and to break the complex things into smaller pieces. And since you have a musical background, you understand, you can't just tackle the whole song at once. You have to actually break it into pieces. and then learn how to extract things that you need to get better at. Like, oh, I suck at arpeggios or something, so I need to go and focus in on that. So with programming, it's kind of the same thing. You sort of start with the fundamentals, isolate the things that are very challenging for you and focus on that, and then just be willing to do a lot of practice, essentially.
Great advice. Great advice. Awesome. Okay. Now we're going to switch into some hot topics / controversies. And so whatever extent you feel comfortable opining is fair game. And we won't push too hard on any given issue necessarily. But I do think that I want to reiterate something about our podcast network, which is we want to give people as much runway as they want on these type of issues, because I think one pattern we're noticing is that increasingly, as we're trying to make sense in society, in data science, as well as just more generally, that the more good faith and rigorous the conversation can be, and sometimes that takes time and people, fumble over words and, make mistakes, the better off we all are in the long run. So we're trying to embody that here. So any of your thoughts on any or all of these topics is greatly appreciated. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So first, data science is quite clearly, I would say, shaking things up. Do you think that that's a fair thing to say, just generally within the? Okay.
Yeah,
I think it's doing that within industry and also academia, and so we'll touch on both of these things. So first, how would you say, even because you work in tech, whereas I when I was doing analytics-based stuff, I was working in the utility industry, which if tech is at the forefront of things, the utility industry is very much structurally a laggard, because most utilities can only operate on the cost reduction side because they're revenue capped.
Right.
So you're playing with fewer degrees of freedom, so to speak. But that's okay. I think there's probably similarities in terms of how data science, generally, how people are, maybe a better way to say it, how people are trying to make data-driven decisions in the modern age. That's shaking things up. How would you say that that's affecting companies in terms of how they think about their data pipelines, legacy systems, that type of thing?
Boy, it kind of depends on the company, because I work for a lot of organizations that they like the appeal and sort of like the sexiness of having data scientists, but they're not willing to invest in the things that you need in order for that to actually be impactful. Invest as in invest the time, the resources, the software, or like the data architecture, the talent, like these are a lot of different things that you should invest in before thinking about probably even hiring a data scientist.
Yes.
And so there are those organizations. And then there's obviously the more mature organizations, or ones that primarily function within tech. They're much more mature. But I will also say, the bigger the organization, the more, I would say the more focused you are on a particular scope. So you're not going to be like a jack of all trades, someone who's building the data architecture and you're also doing the data engineering and you're doing the modeling and everything. Some people like that, some people don't, but I think there is a good balance. But I would say in the tech industry, it's definitely more focused on a sliver of that.
Do you think that has anything to do with the fact that the tech industry broadly is built around information systems and kind of these either online platforms or cloud services, and their business model is very much centered around the type of technologies that these different data disciplines interact with?
100%. It's their core business model. It's usually directly tied to the services and products that they're selling, but also because they're so large and because they're, I guess, so profitable, they can afford to hire like 1 million data scientists. And so that comes with the extra resources that maybe a smaller organization might not have. Sure.
So I won't name the company I work for, though it's no secret if people look at LinkedIn, for example. But I was one of two kind of individual contributor levels, right? So kind of frontline level folks. It was myself who was working in quality assurance data analytics, and a person working in engineering. We were in a room with probably about 2 or 3 dozen managers and directors, and we were just there because our managers and directors were like, you guys deal with this stuff for us, so you guys go instead of us. And it was with a tech company. I won't name which one. It wasn't Microsoft. I'll say that. How about that? It wasn't Microsoft. And they were coming in, they were doing the consulting thing. Hey, look at all these like great projects we've done for these other companies, and maybe we could do this for you. And this gentleman, his name is Sam, and I looked at each other and we're like, this would be great, but also, where's the infrastructure? Where's the, we're both trying to do, work towards this in whatever small capacity we can as a QA personnel and engineering personnel, kind of where is that, that talent stack, that skill set, and then obviously the fundamental infrastructure changes that need to happen. It's interesting to see how the consulting appeal differs between people who have kind of more technical exposure versus people who perhaps are more on the soft side of business, which is, both are important, certainly. But perhaps there's a difference in terms of how people assess and prioritize movement towards making data-driven decisions.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Like if you're at an organization, I think I've experienced this myself, an organization that maybe have fewer of those technical hands and more of the more business side. Obviously they don't necessarily understand as intimately as you do everything that goes behind the data architecture, the information systems, all of that. And so they wouldn't quite know. But the problem is that here you are and you need that stuff. And so you have to make a case for it or caveat why you're not able to achieve certain things.
Yep, certainly. I think you mentioned picking up a list of skills that one might need if they're breaking into this space by looking at job descriptions. And that's actually something that I did whenever I was at this past company. And I saw that you at least need some deliverable data visualization skill set. So I picked, not to plug Microsoft, I picked Power BI, and I took home a dashboard that we were, regularly extracting data from databases and manually plugging it in and just automated it over a weekend in Power BI. And it wasn't because I was some whiz. I knew what the final product had to look like because I worked with it each week. And I knew a little bit about Power BI, but not a lot. And I think that that is something where you can take the initiative, even if all the pieces aren't in place. And I have a feeling it depends. Some people subscribe to the idea that you should ask for forgiveness later rather than asking for permission on the front end. I don't know if I would give that as general advice, but if you're aware of what who the stakeholders are in terms of like getting access to systems and that kind of thing, a lot of times I think you have more kind of the more you learn your role and how it is situated within your department or your division and the company, the more you can kind of map out, okay, well, maybe these are some people I need to talk to about getting access to this type of information, even if my role directly doesn't have the responsibility for that type of data.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good recommendation actually to folks who are trying to get more into analytics and data science, because to your point, you might not necessarily have access to the data right now, but if you can make a business argument as to why you should have access to it and maybe even provide like a template of what you're thinking about, that can not only make you look really good on your job, but you're also learning on the job.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and you create the opportunity for a win-win.
Yes.
And then you're more credible down the line too. And if they say no, then you're just back where you started. It's no problem, right? Hasn't cost you very much. Okay, so kind of on this, data science shaking things up in industry, how would you say that leaders in organizations should balance two competing priorities? And this will probably get into some stuff we'll talk about later, but I suspect you, like I, have had situations either personally or with people where they're junior candidates trying to break in and they can't, it's tough to break in. I think that's fair to say. So how do you balance allowing, making it more welcoming, perhaps more expansive for people breaking in, with the other side of the coin, which is that there are certainly a lot of people, you mentioned the internship difference in pay, who will see something like that and go, okay, well, I'll just put together whatever I need to on my resume to like try and get these positions. So there's some people who are, rent seeking, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
to try and cash in on a field that's hot right now. And I think that's honestly why people get so frustrated with the buzzwordification
Yes.
of data science. How would you,
Mhm.
if you have any thoughts on this, how would you balance those two competing priorities?
Yeah, that's a very good question. As someone who has been a hiring manager, I would say that what I try to do when it comes to hiring like more junior people is to make sure that there is a pipeline for them, that there, first of all, is an entry level role for them to go into, and that that leads potentially to a role with more responsibility, a little bit more advanced technical requirements. And so that they're exposed to all this technology and what they need to know to become a data scientist. And I think that organically, I think what happens is that they realize whether or not they want to do that. And I've seen that too, where, I might hire a data analyst or a senior data analyst. And, they say, I want to get more involved with some of the data science, some of the ML stuff, And I was like, cool, like, here's a small little project, that you can work on. And then like they'll have this question, and some of them will really embrace it, like, oh, this is really interesting. What should I learn? Where should I go? And some of them are like, you know what? I don't think this is really like what I want to do.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right?
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. I'm thinking of a cousin of mine who works here in Houston. Actually, he's moving to Ohio.
Oh,
Yeah, very shortly with his family. But he's great. He's an exceptionally hardworking, proactive person. Doesn't work in the data science space, but worked in the master data space for a while. So like ERP systems, that kind of thing.
mhm.
And his experience with some of his coworkers and my experience with some of my former coworkers who are also in that space is, being a senior master data specialist, and you've been working in the industry for a few decades, nothing wrong with that trajectory. If you're someone who
Mhm.
really knows the systems, you're very valuable to a company. You can provide a lot of great feedback. You don't have to be the person doing the flashy things, quote unquote, because a lot of times the people doing the flashy things really, really rely on the competence
Yeah.
of people who have that mastery of stuff that would seem, perhaps less glamorous, but equally as
Yeah.
important.
I have a question for you, actually, Michael.
Yes,
I'm
go ahead.
curious. Why do you think that data science has become this glamorous child of like tech? Because there's other jobs that didn't get that same like PR, I guess.
So are you talking about jobs like data architecture or data engineering?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Why weren't those,
Okay.
or even like looking at like database administrators or whatever,
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, why don't those get the same level of consideration or obsession, as data science does?
So I'll qualify my answer in that this is just my opinion. And so all the DBAs and DEs and all you guys, I understand that this is like my very narrow perspective. So, and we love you guys. We need you guys. And you folks are doing great work. However, you asked why is there this appeal? And I think that for me, for example, I had some background in statistics because I came from life science. And when I saw the overlap, when I was doing my graduate training, I thought, oh, okay. So there is the way we can make sense of the world to the
Mm,
extent we can. It shares this commonality of something like probabilistic reasoning towards constructive
mm,
ends, or at least away from destructive ends, something like that. And so I thought, okay, well, that's a general heuristic I can follow. And then that kind of led me down a philosophical path where I favor prediction over low-level explanations.
ah,
That's one. The other, and I think this is maybe a more general rule, is that though database administrators, data architects, data engineers, the work they do is fundamental to a lot of the
yeah.
work data scientists are able to do, and and arguably more fundamental to the day-to-day running of an organization than data
Mm,
science. I think that increasingly with the availability of powerful machine learning algorithms, increasingly people who have the credibility to call themselves data scientists have some sort of social credibility about being able to say what things are and are not, or what things should be
mm,
and shouldn't be, just because they
mm.
work with the modeling side, right? They produce
I see.
the model that gives you some sort of prediction or tests some sort of potential prescription. And I don't necessarily endorse that view, but I think that that is a very powerful force for a lot of people.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. Like everyone wants to be the oracle.
Right. Yeah. And this actually will get right into something we're talking about in just a moment, which is, kind of having different perspectives on a team to try and make sure that there's, you reduce your blind spots maximally and take a comprehensive approach to the problems you're trying to solve. Which I think is another reason data science is hot, is that, there's this consideration of, hey, maybe we've overlooked some things historically. So we've talked about data science shaking up industry, and perhaps we'll spend a little bit less time on this because you and I are the only gluttons for punishment that I'm aware of who will be listening to this podcast, who are also doing the academic side of things. But it's also shaking up research. And so if you could tell me what the PhD program you're in is and how you view the overlap between that PhD program and data science, if there is one.
Oh, yeah. So I'm doing a PhD in information technology at University of the Cumberlands, and the program is based out of their information and computer sciences school. And they sort of have different specializations. So there are some folks who specialize in cybersecurity. There's some folks who specialize in, it's named information technology, which is like the same name as the degree, but essentially the information technology specialization is more on like the data mining side of things. So using like different database technology, using data science and big data solutions. And so I guess I would say that the program overlaps in that is about how to use information systems and how to set information governance and strategy to achieve basically the things we were just talking about. Like, are you even ready to have a data scientist? So that's kind of what the program focuses on.
Awesome. Okay, fair enough. And for context, people, I'm at University of Houston doing a degree in ostensibly information systems, but we'll see what it actually ends up being in. But that's the label anyway. So very similar, perhaps a little bit less technically focused. The information systems field, this will come as a surprise to most people. So you'll please give me your feedback on this. It's mostly just been social. There should be a lot of professors who take issue with this. That's okay. It's mostly just social psychology with work groups historically that have worked with computers. So like a lot of behavioral research. Not that there's anything wrong with behavioral or experimental research. Again, life sciences background, all for it. But in terms of the utility of a lot of social scientific theories, they have they have an upper limit on their explanatory power as compared to, natural science theories, broadly speaking.
Yes, I can definitely see that, because a lot of the core courses I had to take as part of the program were more focused on like the strategy, the governance, the like emerging risks and things like that. It was really the specialization courses that allowed you to kind of dive a little bit more into the area that you're interested in. And then obviously the research, which is, heavy on stats and things like that.
Sure. Yeah. And that's an applied setting, right? Because you're going to have to use the stats towards testing something or explaining something. Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing I would say for folks who are interested in breaking into this space and are considering the academic route is, well, one, really, really consider that very carefully. Two, if I hope that what you hear in your answer, Leondra, which is, there are these specializations that you can get once you get past the fundamentals that kind of open the landscape back up to you. I have a similar experience, except that at the time when I was going through those specialization courses, certain things like machine learning were prohibitive, like you could not go do that for reasons that I'll go into in a different episode. But I'm not failing to broach the topic now because I fear reprisal from my university. I don't care and they don't care. We're past that stage. But I will say, be strategically disagreeable and kind of like you would make a business case for having access to data in industry, make the case about why having more tools in your tool belt will help you solve a different or a more broad array of problems. It doesn't mean that you're sacrificing deep knowledge for, the broad but shallow.
Mhm.
Instead, what you're
Mhm.
saying is I'm willing to undergo and do both. And, that's a lot of responsibility for someone to take on. But I think,
Yes,
in our experience, it's probably been rewarding that way.
absolutely. I had a similar experience with my university. I think I like asked to take a particular math class. I was like, oh, that sounds dope. Can I take that? And they're like, I mean, you can, but it's not gonna like
Mhm.
go towards your degree or anything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Certainly. So even when people shut doors, that's okay. You have the opportunity to get creative about how you get to that end anyway. And a lot of times I
Yes.
can help bring things out of you. I think one thing that's been rewarding for me is we have a relatively large cohort for
Mm.
our program. Traditionally, we have 4, so I have 3 peers, and all of
Oh.
us have stuck through so far. So we're all into our goodness. This will be going in our 4th year next year. So
Wow.
it's great that way. I'm very grateful for them. They have been fantastic. They have come around because they have a little bit less empirical exposure than I do. They've
Uh-huh.
come around to this, not that they want to master machine learning or deep learning or anything like that, but they want to be able to read a paper that uses those techniques and
Mm.
have some way to gauge the
Yes.
results, for example. And
Yes.
so I talked with a couple people who are still theory inclined, but are open to the empirical side of things about
Mhm.
how they would go about doing this, because they're both very technically skilled too on the
Oh.
quantitative techniques. And they said, well,
Mhm.
you can pick it up as you need. You can learn it on the job. And I thought, well, one of you is an actuary and the other one of you has only siblings with math PhDs. So like,
Oh my
perhaps you
gosh.
guys are not the most, it's not the most generalizable case set
Yeah.
to go from. But what I'd learned was, okay, well, if you can take away a few core things, so basic statistics training, linear algebra, um,
Mhm.
econometric techniques, if you can kind of abstract out some introductory level there and offer that as a supplemental path training, then maybe those are true. Maybe you can't just pick up a book and learn it as you need. And so
Yeah.
what we did was we started developing like a peer-led group that covered those things. It's no grades, maybe like a chapter
Uh-huh.
of reading a week, relatively
Uh-huh.
little work, but at least you had the exposure. And I think it served at least myself and one other person well, and some
Uh-huh.
of the junior cohorts have really benefited from it as well, which is nice.
Oh, yeah, that is very creative. That's cool that you guys decided to just take action anyway, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like well, they can't stop us as long as we're doing everything that they want us to be doing. So if we're
Yeah.
willing to take on, if this is actually something we're interested in, we're willing to take on the responsibility to go and pursue it, then let's do it. So what I'll do is because those are aggregated from free online material, is I'll drop those in this episode's artifact, in addition to some of the free, or as you mentioned, affordable online venues that people can explore for advanced training in this area. So
Yeah.
feel free to use them. They're crowdsourced. There's, as far as I'm aware, everything is fair use in there. And if not, then I'll get in trouble. No one else will. All right. So Leondra, we've got about, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes or so left. You've been very generous with your time. I want to ask you 2 general questions that are, kind of still in this controversy space. And then I promised a fun rapid fire round, and we'll get to that. So this one is one of those annoying questions that if we're asked in an interview, you'd be like, come on. But it's interesting because I think it makes people think about maybe some of the more medium to long-term
Mhm.
implications for data science and how we balance that with other considerations.
Mm.
I'm very bullish on data science, but I don't think it's the answer to everything, for example. So
Mhm.
in a world full of nearly perfect predictions or perfect predictions, whichever you prefer, what is the
Mhm.
role of human understanding?
Ooh, I've never gotten that question in an interview. I think that's a fascinating question. Um, well, I do think that if that were to be possible, that there is something to be said about understanding the model that produced those predictions and why it's able to do so. I think that human understanding is still very much required. I know a lot of talk is around like auto ML stuff right now in terms
Mhm.
of being able to make it more click of a button ish.
Right.
And maybe in the future, at some point, it literally will be a click of a button, and that would be very fascinating. but it's just hard for me to imagine being completely removed from the problem and the context and having to understand the inner workings of both the problem and the model. So I think human understanding will always be required, even if the predictions are perfect. And then I don't know if this is in the scope of your question, but I was talking to a friend about how like I don't even have to remember certain things anymore because of like autocomplete and things like that. So if we're also talking about how will human development look, or the evolution of humans look, if we no longer have to think a lot about a lot of things because we have a model that will do it for us, I'm actually curious as well. Like obviously it's a luxury to not have to do derivatives by hand anymore, because you can just upload a package and it'll do it for you. But yeah, I don't know really how I feel about losing or having grown distance between the model itself and myself.
That's a fair answer. It's a tough question, no matter what your background or your training is, but I really appreciate you taking it seriously. I think that the reason I chose understanding there, because I've heard a variant of this question from one of the people on my committee, actually, and I thought it was good, but understanding, I think people will say that science contributes to the domain of human knowledge, which I don't think is precise enough. What it does, because I think you can have a model that predicts well, that still you can know that it's predicting well. For example, you may not know why, as you mentioned, knowing the intricacies of the model. And you can also have models that are more evolutionary and that are more hardwired into people. And it's kind of an inherited model or heuristic. And you don't necessarily have to know why that's the case to know that it has some functional utility, or it had some functional utility. But if you go to the level of understanding, it's richer. And so I think that in the best and most generalizable case, social scientific theories should aim to expand the domain of human understanding. And so I like your answer. I like that you touched on knowing why the model's working or why they do. Perhaps there's something, arguably there's something truly stochastic about the nature of reality anyway. So just because a model's working this week, if it stops working next week, we might need some people who can help us make sense of why that happened or what we should do then. There's also the interesting implication about if you have multiple models that seem to be performing, relatively well compared to one another, how do you vet those models? And this can be in the prediction space, or it can be in the traditional, academic research setting space. How do you evaluate potential, explanations that seem to be mutually exclusive from one another?
Yeah, that's really interesting. We're almost talking like the philosophy of
certainly
modeling a little bit. And yeah, as someone who is trying to become more well-versed in deep learning, I can definitely see like how there's that balance in complexity and explainability, where it's like, let's use this if it's the best model, but in terms of explaining how it works or why it works, it's not as simple as like a decision tree or something. So yeah, it's interesting. I think just like anything else in life, there's pros and cons to it. And it's just about outweighing those for your particular use case.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And being open to feedback about why you might have gotten something wrong, or why things may have changed, and it's time to pivot, to use another buzzword. Okay, so, and just, I guess, for people who maybe aren't as technically, aware or ingrained in this space, you highlighted deep learning there as an example, right, as opposed to a decision tree. Can you perhaps explain just, to a lay person, why there might be different levels of access to understanding how those models are working?
Yes, so deep learning is essentially a group of sort of modeling techniques that are designed more or less after how the human brain kind of functions. So it's uses neural networks. There's a bunch of them. There's CNNs, RNNs, long-term, short-term memory models. But essentially, all of these models aim to take a series of inputs and then does some stuff in the middle, and then it predicts it out at the end as in terms of an output, and it can be multi-label, multi-class, etc. And that stuff that happens in the middle is very math intensive and a lot of like matrix stuff happening, matrix multiplication. You've got these activation functions, and you've got like, your errors, and then like your weights and all this stuff, and bias is happening in the middle. So that is not very meaningful to like a business executive.
Right.
But most people can kind of understand the intuition behind a decision tree, even if they don't understand like information theory, or they don't understand how things are divided up. Like, you understand the intuition, similar to like Bayesian statistics, for instance. Like, I still get caught up on a lot of the logic behind it, but it's actually very intuitive to how we think about things anyway. So deep learning is just not very intuitive, essentially.
Agreed. Yeah. And a decision tree, it's easy to represent pictorially, for example.
Yeah.
And it's like you said, it's intuitive. It's easy to abstract. But if you showed someone, especially models that people in tech are working with that are, deep learning, and you showed them a visual representation of it, and you said, this is our, our model, our trained model, it would mean not very much to most people. And even some people who use that for important decisions, all that, what you called stuff in the middle is, for a lot of people, even technical people, it is just stuff in terms of something needs to be tuned or trained, but that stuff is not as easy to probe as something, for example, like a decision tree or a traditional regression model, something like that.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. All right, Leondra, last question before the fun rapid fire. And this deals with the topic of diversity. So this topic has also come up. I think it's a hot topic in data science, more generally as well, obviously, but also in data science. And this is where I think that data science actually has something, probably a lot of things to contribute. But it's certainly not immune from obviously historical and legacy artifacts and the difficult and thorny challenges of increasing diversity in the workplace. So I was wondering, first, can we talk about diversity from training perspectives, so people's different backgrounds, right? So obviously we come from non-traditional data science backgrounds. We talk about demographic diversity, for example, right? So perhaps under or overrepresented groups in here, and what, why that might be the case, and how might we make data science more accessible going forward. And then also philosophical, but we can leave that for a little bit. So training and demographic, however you want to take this.
For training, well, actually for both, it's a very, very, as you sort of hinted to, complex thing to tackle, because the bulk of the work required to make it more equitable doesn't sit just on one institution. It's not like, hey, Google, you need to hire more diverse, or it's not just even like, hey, universities, you need to make sure that all your students are at least exposed to like programming or something. Or even like, we can bring it all the way down to like grade school. Like, it's just, unfortunately, it takes a whole village to tackle both the training and the demographic part of diversity. I think that there is a misconception that data science or tech in general is immune to the diversity problem, because I think tech is generally correlated, or people think that it's correlated more liberal towns or something like New York, LA, San Francisco, Seattle. So I think there's the perception that people who work in those spaces are just as diverse as those cities, but that's not usually the case. And so if I'm being asked, like, how do you fix that? It's so huge. Like, it's so hard because, again, as someone who was a hiring manager, I can tell you, looking at the resumes that I received, you don't get a lot of people from certain either training backgrounds or from demographic backgrounds or even geographically, like it's rare to get someone from Arkansas, or something like that.
Okay.
And when I do, I usually jump on it because it's so fascinating to me. And I hired a young woman from Wyoming. Actually, I ended up hiring two people from Wyoming. And actually they had a natural science background. They had a geography geography. It's like with rocks. People who study rocks.
So geology.
Geology.
Yeah, fair enough. A lot of
I'm
geos.
smart. I promise you I'm smart.
No, trust me, I'm aware. You're good.
Yeah, they were both geology majors actually, and they wanted to get into the analytics. But yeah, it's a very challenging question, but I think that the way that we can address it is that everyone has to realize they can either be a part of the solution or they can kind of not help or not do anything. So for me, I went out of my way to like go on LinkedIn and to find more diverse candidates, people who have a background in English or something and who did a boot camp in software engineering. Because a lot of people who do boot camps get looked over sometimes. Or trying to find people from more ethnically diverse backgrounds or more women or just more people who you don't typically see in that space, instead of just playing a very passive role and just letting HR sort of send me resumes. I took it upon myself to actually go out and try to recruit people. So yeah, I think unfortunately or fortunately, it takes a whole village to tackle that problem. There's a lot of probably policy and legislative things that need to be put in place. But I think universities should focus on, especially these universities that call themselves liberal arts, liberal arts is not just studying a little bit of English and taking a philosophy class and taking a music intro theory class. It should also include, hey, let's take a object-oriented programming course just to round you out a little bit. I think that's valuable.
Sure. Okay. So I can see that. So I don't want to put you in an unfair position because you maybe I misspoke, but you talked about it as a problem to solve.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot embedded in that, and it's a fair conceptualization, but it's probably a lot of problems. And perhaps some aspects of it are not like, for example, you mentioned your resumes didn't have the same demographic representation, for example, of LA, were not the resumes you were getting, right? And so I was like, well, is that a problem? It's like, well, it depends. There's a lot going on there, right? Because there's a lot of steps that precede someone submitting a resume to your job posting. And I think that your approach to being proactive about how you recruit and perhaps network in places that are traditionally overlooked is a good one. For those of you who are in hiring manager positions, there are ways to do this that are legal, and there's ways to do this that are illegal. Make sure you're doing them in the legal ways. And also, you can do that in a way that's kind of like a rising tide lifts all ships, right? It doesn't have to be, how do I say this? For example, I'll just come out and say my perspective is like, I don't think quota-based anything is very I think it maybe provides the veneer of a short-term solution,
right,
with long-term costs and downside and backfire and all sorts of stuff that is not productive. But you can do things in a way that is constructive and does have a kind of cast a wider net.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the quota thing is almost like it defeats the purpose, because it almost makes it seem like it's no longer about inclusivity, but it's like this quantitative process of meeting a certain number, but it's like, how do you, it's hard, man. It's a huge thing. And like you said, the process starts before the application process. It starts way before, and there's only so much institutions can actually do about that. So,
or even, I would argue, even should do about that.
Or even should do, right? Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean that we have to throw up our hands and say, okay, well, everything is perfect as is, or there's, nothing further that we need to work on. Certainly I don't think that's the case. I worked at a former company in a informal capacity because I had some quantitative background and the person who was doing this didn't. But this individual was aware of my background and they said, hey, we're working on some diversity and leadership metrics, separate issues. Would you kind of have any insights? And I said, sure. And I had some ecology background, and there's diversity measures that are very common there. They come from information theory as well as some other ones, biodiversity, that kind of stuff. And so I said, okay, well, here's some metrics we can think about, operationalizing. But there's two things I'm going to say. If I'm going to do this, one, like, you have to like CYA for yourself, right? So like do whatever you need to there. But two, we're not going to do this in terms of advocating for any outcome predetermined. If it's going to be data driven and we want to be aware of where we stand, then we're going to be evidence-based. And one prescriptive solution that you should not advocate for, because it's a terrible precedent, is quota-based anything for selection. And we thought, because, this company operates in a variety of geographic footprints with people of different backgrounds. One thing they could do, this is just as something that might be useful for people who are trying to think of ways to increase representation in the workforce without opening themselves up to kind of backfire effects, or maybe arbitrarily lowering some bar that doesn't need to be lowered. And that's said kind of imprecisely, but I think you get what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
What you can do is you could start putting stuff in there, like if you have a geographic footprint where, for example, you're in Houston, it's very diverse, make bilingual, have that be an additional perk for people for, any role that is client facing, internal client or external client, because you're going to have people from, Vietnamese backgrounds, Hispanic backgrounds, Middle Eastern backgrounds, like all sorts of stuff, where that could be something where it's a natural way to say, hey, this is an asset for our team.
Yes.
It recognizes that there is some intrinsic diversity that, could be, forwarded here, but you're not doing it in a way where you're saying like, oh, we need a person who looks like this. And it's like, that's so, it's a crude intervention, to say the least. Let's put it that way.
Yes. And I'll also say that I read an article a long time ago, and I would butcher it if I tried to cite it, but essentially it was critiquing Silicon Valley's method of filtering applications based on the kind of school that someone attended.
Right.
And that obviously backfired a little bit because, there's multiple ways, right? For instance, going to an Ivy League university might not be the most affordable thing for someone, for one. And then for two, maybe someone went to an HBCU, and maybe that's not considered as highly or as prestigious, or maybe someone went to a community college, or something like that, or a state college, these things are, they should be, I think, still considered very strong candidates, given their background and their experience. So, there's a lot of practices, to your point, that can backfire and go against what I guess they're trying to do. Yeah.
Even something like the Ivy League admissions, it's all great. And, I don't want to be a hypocrite because you and I both did something associated with one of the Ivies, but they also have a very large legacy admission. And I'm not knocking any individual legacy member might be, exceptionally qualified, but the idea that it's a great signal for expertise is, I think, at best questionable at this point in time. So we've touched on issues of, you mentioned diversity. You said something about being equitable in the workplace, inclusive. I think it's fair to say that these have taken on a small p political connotation in some sense. And I want to get into that in terms of like the political philosophical aspect. But I do, before I say that, I want to say that I think some of the best aspects of those three, especially the triad together, is this notion of belonging, in that if someone is there, whether they look the same as the people they're working with or look differently based on some superficial or not so superficial characteristics, the idea that, hey, we're all here, we can work towards constructive ends. Maybe we're even like tense with each other at times, but it produces something useful at the end. And everyone belongs here, right? We've all passed through the bars necessary to get here. I think that speaks to the imposter syndrome, more generally, but it also speaks to the idea that, hey, people can break through into these spaces. And data science, though not perfectly, I think increasingly over time, it's going to be there are some objective skill sets that you can demonstrate, and you can become undeniable. And
Yeah.
hopefully the whatever arbitrary additional hurdles some people face versus others, hopefully those are erased as quickly as possible.
Yes, hopefully. And I really like what you said, that like just trusting the process a little bit once you are admitted to whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. Like trust that you are qualified and that you belong there.
Okay. All right. So last sub question and then the rapid fire. So we
Yes.
talked about kind of demographic diversity, kind of background training diversity, skill set diversity. Now, philosophical, and you could take this the political route, or you can say, you know, deontological utilitarian, or you could see a positivist, interpretivist, whatever you want. But generally speaking, I think there is a perception that data science generally, but especially within big tech, has a very specific, at least public facing philosophy. Do you think that first, does that make sense, what I'm saying?
I think so. I
Okay.
think so. Yeah.
Okay. And do you think that is A, accurate, and B, do you think just like having people with various different training backgrounds or who come from different, you know, cultural backgrounds, let's say, just like there's some added utility there in terms of considering things from a different angle that maybe you hadn't considered before, or not overlooking a problem with your model, for example, that you know you otherwise would. Do you think that extends politically? Could someone who is a Bernie Sanders supporter, an Elizabeth Warren supporter, a Donald Trump supporter, and a Mike Pence supporter, could they all have something unique to offer on a data science team?
Oh, wow. Yeah. These are great questions, Michael. Yes, I think so. And for the same reason, this probably will get a little political, but you know, as I mentioned, I'm from Ohio. You know, I'm from a Midwest state, and even thinking about moving to another Midwest state because I live in LA right now. So growing up, I was used to what I would quantify as a more of a political discourse. You know, I guess Ohio can be considered a swing state, maybe. There's a lot of states kind of in the middle that tend to go back and forth between red and blue, and that's because you have sort of a mix of those perspectives. And I would also argue that, not to get too political, but I would argue that some of the politicians there might have a little bit more of a fire underneath them because they know that they are not automatically voted in. You know, like there's some discourse where it's like, you know, I might not vote for you if you do that again. So as someone who now lives in a coastal city, it's a little bit different. LA obviously is very progressive, it's very liberal. And so I say all this to mean that I think the same thing can happen in business on a team, where if you have too much of one perspective, you're not really going to be achieving much more than an echo chamber, essentially.
Okay.
And I think that even if there's someone on the team who you're like, I don't know what they're talking about, I think they're crazy and I think their ideas are stupid. Like, even if you have that kind of attitude towards someone, at least now you know that perspective exists. You know, that's good to know. I'll give a more concrete example. I went to another data science conference that was in New York, and we got to sit in this like almost like a little panel, but except everyone was part of the panel in a weird way. So we were just talking about our experience in data science. And there was this gentleman who worked for a big tech company. I won't mention who it is. And I believe he worked in Florida. I think he was in Florida. And the company that he was working with was consulting the police department in that area. And they were building a model to essentially predict who was going to commit a crime and what was going to happen, where it was going to happen. And as you can imagine, that's a very, very sticky subject.
Lots of landmines, for sure.
Lots of landmines there. And what was very surprising to me was that he didn't see anything sticky about it. He didn't see anything like even controversial really about it until we engaged in that discourse in that room. So I don't think anyone he worked with really had the opposite perspective to share with him. And he worked very closely with the police department, and it sounded like, you know, they they had a particular way that they went about doing things, and none of it was questioned because he was like, this is how they did it. This is the data. I plugged it in. Here's the answer,
Right.
So I think it is very important to have people from different, different backgrounds in every way, different, political affiliation or different educational background. Obviously, like you mentioned, you have to have that core fundamentals, but
Right.
presuming you have that, I think there's always value in diversity.
Awesome. So that's great. I think that's a great thing to kind of switch to our questions. I want to put a bow on that. This idea that everyone has at least the same fundamental training, right? You can specialize and have different levels of expertise in different areas once you're within an organization, but everyone's passed at least some bar that is non-trivial to get in. And then we can all agree that we're working at least not destructively and hopefully constructively towards positive ends.
Yes.
And then I think that if you have that agreement and you have that kind of standardization on the front end, I think that it's a philosophical axiom for me. It's diversity. How could it be anything other than a strength?
Yes.
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 Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you, Leondra. So, all right, a few rapid fire questions, and that doesn't mean you have to answer them very quickly. You can answer them with whatever time you want. So, do you have a favorite algorithm?
Oh, favorite algorithm. Like data modeling algorithm.
Modeling. Yep.
I would say, I think random forest is pretty cool.
Random forest. Okay. Any particular reason why?
When I first learned about it, like I was basically upgrading my data science toolkit from decision trees, right? And when I learned about random forest, I remember being blown away about the concept of having like this voting system where it's like you have all these trees, and then depending on how those results turn out, it almost like averages that result. And then when I was reading about it, I can't remember what book I was reading, but they were tying it to like just how humans in general kind of act. And I just thought that was really cool. So the concept of using a model that uses multiple models and then tries to like aggregate those results, I always thought that was pretty cool.
Awesome. Okay. Fair enough. Mac or PC?
Ooh.
Sorry, Linux folks. I know. We hear you.
And I'm not saying this because of my employer, but honestly, I do prefer PC. Yeah.
Fair enough. Same. R or Python?
Ooh. So I learned R first, and I was all about it, and I still am all about it. But now that I've learned Python, it feels more applicable to other stuff. So, I might say Python, and I've never said that out loud, so that feels weird.
Well, fair enough. We won't hold it against you. And I think that's a fair thing to say as well. Like both for the modeling side and the statistics side of things, both are very usable. Python probably does have a little bit more general appeal in that it can be used for other things as well.
Yes.
I'm hearing the voice of someone in my head. That same individual who has the accounting background and played violin, he would argue with me, and he's a data science director, so fair enough. But we'll have that conversation another day. All right, tabs or spaces?
Tabs.
All right, cloud or on-prem?
Cloud. Yeah.
Okay. Early bird or night owl?
Night owl. Yeah.
All right. Stradivarius or a Staunton chess set?
A Staunton chess set. Yeah.
All right. Fair enough. All right. One final question. What is one question I should have asked you, but I didn't?
Oh, interesting. One question you should have asked me, but didn't. I honestly found your questions so insightful and so in depth. You really had me thinking pretty hard on a lot of those questions. So I don't know. I feel like, I feel like you did ask a lot of the even some questions that I think some people don't ask enough, but I do wish that I asked you more questions, if that makes any sense, because I feel like I wanted your perspective on some things.
Sure. Well, if you'd like, you're more than welcome to ask them now, and certainly we can do this again. Be happy to do that.
Yeah, we should totally do this again. If not, on this, just personally, because it'd be to get your take. But where do you see yourself going? After your program is up. I know you mentioned, teaching is not necessarily the top of your list.
Mhm.
Where do you like to be?
So once I'm done with this PhD program, assuming that I complete it, because it's of course a roll of the dice semester to semester, not in
Yeah,
terms of bandwidth or anything necessarily, just in terms of mutual interest,
yeah.
and no hard feelings on either party's part, as far as I'm aware. I am interested in potentially teaching. I don't believe in the academic incentive structure, and this is a topic for
Oh,
another day probably, but
mhm.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. And so I think that, well, I've already turned down a very healthy salary once because I
Wow.
didn't believe in the incentive. And this is not me being like, virtuous or anything. It's just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
my internal code. Like it was tough, but it was obviously the right
Yeah,
decision in the long term.
yeah.
Um, so I don't care how glamorous the position is if I don't
Mhm.
believe in the incentive structure. So honestly, I think that my goals are not to be a podcaster for life. That's not what I want to be. But I want to have interesting conversations with folks. I want to help people solve problems with math. And I think
Mhm.
that there's an underappreciated aspect of fake news. That's what my research is on.
Right,
And
right.
it touches on a lot of, other hot topics these days. And I hope to help not so much inform policy as a top-down measure, but to improve understanding as a bottom-up. And so
Mm.
probably hopefully working as a data scientist with some sort of independent media. And I don't mean politically neutral. I just mean
Yeah, yeah.
not associated with some sort of legacy organization.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, we totally should talk
Yeah.
again. Yeah, that's really cool. You mentioned something that oh, really, keeping your values and knowing what's right for you, regardless of like the compensation package and everything. I think one thing that's really good for listeners to hear is that don't idolize the title so much.
Mhm.
There are a lot of things in life that in your career that are more important than the title. For me personally, who you report to is like it's a deal breaker
Mm.
for me.
Great,
Having
great
a
point.
manager that is like a really good supervisor is key. And my current supervisor, I absolutely love her. I
Mm.
absolutely love her. And one major selling point to going to Microsoft was her. And if I didn't have that kind of feeling, it might not be me here, just because that's very important. And also I would say opportunity, learning opportunity. um you know People who are trying to get into data science, don't scoff at a data analyst title. There's a lot you can do there,
Oh
and
yeah.
arguably being in a safer environment to do so.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's very good advice. The person or people you work for and with, as well as the company, more generally, is going to affect your day-to-day happiness and sense of meaning, probably much more than whether you're a quantitative researcher, a principal data scientist, a data analyst, and as you mentioned before, in due time, you can work your way up. And certainly,
right.
I think you embody that principle. If anyone is curious, just go look at her CV. It's pretty stellar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leondra. So we will definitely do this again. And if you're ever in Houston or generally the area, let me know. We'll do it in person. Wife
Yes.
and I would be happy to take you and your husband out on the town. And
Yeah.
until next time,
All
stay
right.
honest, stay rigorous, and keep speaking freely.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Leondra. We appreciate your support, engagement, and feedback, so feel free to connect with us on any of our social media profiles. You can support our work at freedomcast.locals.com or at freedomcast.us. From Is to Ought is a Freedomcast networked production.